It was a bright morning at the Grand Palace. The sun shone brightly, casting warm rays across the courtyard. But within the palace walls, everything seemed as cold and still as the stone statues that lined the hallways. The royal guards stood motionless, perfectly disciplined, their faces as serious as stone. They were always vigilant, always alert, always maintaining the same stance no matter what. Their uniforms were immaculate, their posture perfect. Not a single word was spoken among them as they kept their watch over the entrance to the royal chambers. The guards had a reputation. They were known for their unshakable focus, their ability to stand still for hours without flinching, and their strict adherence to royal duty. People who visited the palace would often admire the guards from a distance, marveling at their composure and strength. They were symbols of power, order, and protection, and anyone who tried to approach them was immediately met with the cold, impassive stare of someone who wasn't about to break character for anything. But that morning, something unusual was about to happen. A small figure walked into the courtyard, barely noticeable at first. It was a little child, no more than 6 or 7 years old, with bright eyes full of wonder. She skipped across the cobblestones, her laughter echoing, as she gazed up at the towering palace gates. Her curiosity led her straight to the royal guards, her gaze fixed on them, as if she had never seen anything like it before. The guards, of course, did not move. They didn't even acknowledge her presence, standing as still as statues. The child, however, wasn't discouraged. She stood there for a moment, staring up at the guards in awe, before deciding to take a step closer. She reached out her tiny hand toward one of them, but as soon as she did, she hesitated. The guard was so still, so immovable, that it almost seemed like he wasn't even a living person. The child's face lit up with a mix of fear and fascination, but she didn't step back. Instead, she took another step, this time standing right next to the guard. Still, he didn't move. The little girl stared at the guard's face, her eyes full of questions. She had seen many people in the palace, but none of them stood like this. None of them were as still or as serious. "Why are you so still?" she whispered, as if afraid to disturb him. For a moment, nothing happened. The guard's face remained expressionless, his eyes forward, his body as solid as the stone pillars around him. The child waited, expecting no answer. But then, something unexpected occurred. The guard shifted his stance ever so slightly. A small twitch of his eyebrow, a barely noticeable movement of his head, was enough to show that he had heard her. He glanced down at her, his expression softening ever so slightly, though he quickly regained his composure. The child, shocked but encouraged, smiled up at him. For the first time, the guard's lips parted. "Because it's my job to stand guard, little one," he said quietly. His voice was calm, deep, but there was an unexpected warmth to it. The little girl's eyes widened. She wasn't sure if she had imagined it, but the guard had spoken to her. For a moment, the palace seemed to pause as the child and the guard shared a brief, silent understanding. The guards around them, though still standing perfectly still, seemed to shift slightly in response. Something had changed, though it wasn't obvious to anyone watching. The child, oblivious to the bigger picture, smiled and skipped away, leaving behind a guard who, for the first time in a long while, broke free from his strict and stoic persona. And so that small interaction, as brief and simple as it was, marked the beginning of something unexpected, a shift that no one in the palace could have predicted. After the young girl left, something lingered in the air, an unspoken change that no one seemed to notice at first. The royal guards stood in their usual positions, watching over the grand palace with the same unwavering attention as before. But for the one who had spoken to the child, things felt different. He couldn't quite explain it, but there was a sense of warmth that had entered his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. It was subtle, but it was there, tugging at the edges of his mind. The rest of the guards continued their duties as usual, never wavering, their eyes locked on their posts. They were the picture of stoic professionalism, the embodiment of royal strength. They hadn't noticed the small moment that had just unfolded, an innocent exchange between one of their own and a child. But for the guard who had spoken, the memory of the little girl's curious face stayed with him. Her wonder and innocence had pierced through his tough exterior, reminding him of things he hadn't thought about in a long time. As he stood there, his posture still straight, the weight of the armor resting on his shoulders felt a little heavier than usual. It wasn't that he doubted his duty. He had sworn an oath to protect the palace and its people. But today, he found himself questioning something that had always been so clear to him. What did it mean to truly serve? Was it just standing still and being unmovable, or was there something more? The next day, the palace was bustling with activity. The royal family was hosting an important event, and everyone from the palace staff to visiting dignitaries had gathered in the grand hall. The royal guards were stationed at every entrance, as they always were, standing tall and silent. But something was different. The air was thick with the quiet hum of anticipation, and even though the guards were still doing their jobs, there was a sense of restlessness. As one of the guards was walking his usual route, his eyes caught sight of something that made him pause. A young woman, probably in her 20s, was struggling with a heavy cart filled with supplies for the event. Her arms trembled from the weight, and it seemed she was struggling to push it up the slight incline of the palace steps. Normally, the guard would have kept walking, focused solely on his task. But today, something inside him urged him to stop. He found himself stepping toward the woman without thinking. His usual sense of formality and detachment was gone. The woman didn't notice him approaching, her focus entirely on the cart, but when the guard stepped forward and offered his help, her eyes widened in surprise. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should accept help from someone who was supposed to be stationed at his post. But there was something in his gaze, something kind yet unspoken, that made her feel comfortable. "Thank you," she said softly, relief flooding her face as the guard easily took over, pushing the cart up the stairs with little effort. The guard didn't speak. He simply nodded, focusing on the task at hand. But as they reached the top of the stairs, he noticed the way the woman smiled at him. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something deeper. A connection, even if fleeting. He felt a strange sense of satisfaction that he had helped her, a feeling he had never experienced in his years of service. As he returned to his position afterward, he couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. It wasn't that he had done something extraordinary. He had simply helped someone, something that anyone could do. But it felt different. He felt like he had made a difference, even if it was small. And as he resumed his stoic stance, he realized that sometimes moments of kindness were just as important as the duty he had sworn to uphold. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the palace felt different, though no one could pinpoint exactly why. The royal guards, always a symbol of unshakable authority, were now carrying out their duties with something more, something quieter, softer. It was as if they had begun to question their own purpose, their roles, and the deeper meaning behind their unbending discipline. For the guard who had helped the woman with the cart, it was becoming harder to ignore the changes within himself. He had always prided himself on being the perfect soldier, stoic, efficient, and immovable. But now, every time he passed someone in need, he couldn't help but feel an urge to do something more. He had been trained to ignore distractions, to remain unaffected by anything or anyone. Yet with each passing day, he found that ignoring the world around him wasn't as easy as it used to be. One afternoon, as he stood by one of the palace doors, he noticed an elderly man struggling with his cane as he attempted to climb the steep stairs. The man looked worn out, his movements slow and labored. And for a moment, the guard debated whether he should intervene. His training told him to stay put, to remain on watch. But something inside him shifted. Without thinking, he approached the man and gently offered his arm for support. The elderly man looked up in surprise, clearly not expecting any help, but the guard's expression was sincere. "Allow me, sir," the guard said softly, his voice more tender than usual. The elderly man hesitated for a moment, then gratefully took the guard's arm, allowing him to assist him up the stairs. As they reached the top, the elderly man paused and looked at the guard with a kind smile. "Thank you, young man," he said, his voice shaking a little from age, but full of warmth. "You're not like the others, are you?" The guard was taken aback by the question. "What do you mean?" he asked, surprised by the man's perceptiveness. "The others," the man said, gesturing to the other guards who remained steadfast in their positions. "They never show this kind of kindness. But you, there's something different about you." The guard didn't know how to respond. He had never been one to show weakness or emotion, especially not in the presence of someone like the elderly man, who seemed so full of life despite his age. But the words hit him harder than he expected. Was he really different? Was it possible that, after all these years of following orders without question, he had begun to change? As the elderly man moved on, the guard returned to his post. He stood there for a while, thinking about what had just happened. The feeling of helping the elderly man lingered, and he realized that it was a kind of reward he had never known in his years of service. It was a strange feeling, this sense of connection, of making a difference in someone else's life, even if it was just a small act. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that kindness didn't have to weaken him, didn't have to make him less of a soldier. It didn't take away from his duty or his loyalty. In fact, it made him feel stronger in ways he had never imagined. It was a lesson he hadn't expected to learn while standing guard in the royal palace, but it was a lesson that had started to change the way he viewed his place in the world. The guard wasn't sure where this new path would lead, but one thing was clear. He was no longer the same person he had been before, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to go back. As the days passed, the change in the royal guards was becoming more apparent, not just to the staff, but to the people who visited the palace. While the guards still stood tall at their posts, their usual silence and cold demeanor were being replaced by moments of unexpected warmth. For one of the guards, these moments of kindness were beginning to feel less like isolated incidents and more like something he could not ignore. The guard who had helped the elderly man and the woman with the cart found himself thinking about his actions more than he had ever thought about anything before. It wasn't that he had broken his oath or disrespected his duties. It was that he had begun to feel something deeper inside himself. The palace, which once felt like a rigid and mechanical place, now seemed alive with possibilities for connection, and he found himself eager to be a part of that change. One afternoon, the guard was standing near the grand entrance when he noticed a foreign diplomat walking through the palace courtyard. The diplomat appeared troubled, his expression tense as he made his way through the crowd. His clothes were fine, his steps sure, but there was something about him that seemed off. As the guard's eyes followed the diplomat, he couldn't help but notice how exhausted the man looked. His shoulders slumped as though weighed down by something invisible. Without thinking, the guard stepped forward. He wasn't sure why he did it, but something inside him urged him to approach the diplomat. As the guard reached the diplomat, he hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Is everything all right, sir?" the guard asked gently, his voice quieter than usual. The diplomat paused, surprised by the guard's concern. For a moment, he didn't say anything, perhaps unsure if he should trust a palace guard. But there was something in the guard's tone, something sincere, that made him relax. "I've had a long journey," the diplomat finally said, his voice tinged with fatigue, "and I've been dealing with some personal matters. It's been difficult." The guard nodded, understanding more than he let on. Though the diplomat's struggles were not his own, he could empathize with the exhaustion and burden that came with carrying heavy responsibilities. For a moment, the guard stood there, unsure of how to help. But then, without thinking, he simply offered the diplomat his arm. "May I offer assistance, sir?" he asked. "You seem weary." The diplomat looked up at the guard, surprised by the offer. Guards were never supposed to show such gentleness, and yet here this one was, standing before him, offering support. After a moment of hesitation, the diplomat accepted the offer, and together They walked toward the grand hall. The guard remained silent, walking beside the diplomat, offering no judgment, just presence. The conversation, though brief, was enough to make the diplomat feel a little lighter. It wasn't just the physical support the guard offered, but the quiet sense of understanding that seemed to come from the guard's actions. When they reached the door of the grand hall, the diplomat turned to the guard and gave him a small but appreciative smile. "Thank you," he said. "I don't think I've ever received such kindness from a royal guard before." The guard nodded respectfully, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't help but reflect on the exchange. It wasn't just the physical help that had mattered. It was the act of being there for someone when they needed it most. The guard realized, perhaps for the first time, that his true role wasn't just to protect the palace from external threats, but to be a source of strength and kindness for those within it. His duty as a guard was just one part of who he was, but the kindness he had started to show others felt just as important. It wasn't easy to break from the rigid, unfeeling guard he had once been, but now, every time he helped someone, he felt like he was becoming more whole. The palace no longer felt like a place of cold stone walls. It felt like a living, breathing space where kindness could flourish alongside duty. And the guard knew that he was a part of that change, whether he fully understood it or not. The change in the royal guards wasn't something that could easily be seen, at least not at first. To the casual observer, they still stood tall, rigid, and unyielding at their posts, their uniforms sharp, their faces serious. But the small moments that had started to transform the way they interacted with the world were building up, little by little. The one guard, in particular, who had felt this shift most strongly, was beginning to understand that kindness wasn't something that made him weaker, it made him stronger. It was another day at the palace when something unexpected happened, one of those moments that would continue to shape the guards and the way they viewed their role. It was late afternoon, and the palace courtyard was filled with visitors and staff, each going about their duties, preparing for the evening's gala. The air was filled with quiet conversations, the soft hum of voices, and the gentle clinking of serving trays being carried by the palace staff. As the guard stood near one of the palace doorways, keeping watch, he noticed a commotion near the entrance. A small group of children had gathered around a fountain, laughing and playing. They were young, full of energy, and completely oblivious to the importance of the event taking place in the palace that evening. Their joy was contagious, and the guard found himself watching them, something in him drawn to their carefree nature. But then something caught his attention. A little boy, no older than 5, had wandered away from the others. He was trying to climb up the stone steps near the fountain, but his little legs were too short, and his hand struggled to find enough balance on the slippery surface. The boy lost his footing and slipped, falling to the ground with a small cry. Immediately, the other children gasped, their playfulness turning into concern as they crowded around him. They didn't know what to do. The guard, who had been standing nearby, was already moving before he could think twice. His instincts kicked in, and he was at the child's side in an instant, bending down to gently lift him up. The boy's face was scrunched in pain, but when the guard picked him up, he gave him a soft smile and whispered reassuring words. "Are you all right?" the guard asked, his voice calm and steady. The boy, still sniffling, nodded slowly, looking up at the guard's face. His small hand reached up, touching the guard's shiny armor as if trying to understand who had come to help him. For a moment, there was silence. The other children looked on, their expressions a mixture of relief and awe. They had never seen a royal guard like this, one who bent down to help, one who showed kindness instead of just authority. It was a simple gesture, but it left an impact on the children. They weren't used to seeing their protectors act with such tenderness. It wasn't just a soldier who had helped. It was someone who had cared, someone who had taken the time to check if the child was okay. The guard stood up, helping the boy back to his feet. "Be careful next time, all right?" he said gently, his voice full of care. The boy smiled up at him, nodding enthusiastically, his small face beaming. "Thank you," he said, his voice full of gratitude. The other children began to giggle and smile, the tension of the moment melting away as they returned to their play. But for the guard, the moment stayed with him. He watched them run off, their laughter echoing in the courtyard. A part of him felt lighter, almost as if he had just experienced something deeply important, something that went beyond his duty as a protector. As he returned to his post, he couldn't shake the feeling that these small moments were changing him. He had always believed that being the guard meant only protecting the palace from danger, that it was about standing still, unmoving and unfeeling. But now, he understood that his role could be so much more. He was more than just a symbol of strength. He could be a source of comfort, of reassurance, and of kindness. And perhaps most importantly, he realized that these actions didn't make him weaker or less disciplined. They made him a better guard, and more importantly, a better person. As the weeks went by, the changes among the royal guards became more noticeable to those around them. It wasn't just one guard anymore. Slowly, little by little, others began to follow his lead. It was subtle at first, small acts of kindness that were out of place in a place that was usually so strict and formal. But those who were paying attention could see it. The guards, once known for their stoic silence, were beginning to show a new side of themselves. It wasn't something they had been taught, nor was it part of their training. It was something they had discovered on their own, something they couldn't ignore anymore. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the palace, a scene unfolded in the grand hallway that would change everything for the guards. A young woman, a palace servant who had worked tirelessly through the day, was rushing to deliver a message to the royal family. She was clearly exhausted, her steps slow and labored, but the weight of her task pushed her forward. She had been running all day, delivering one message after another. And now, just when she thought she could rest, she had to carry this final one to the royal chambers. As she hurried down the hall, a heavy tray of fine china slipped from her hands. The delicate dishes crashed to the floor, scattering everywhere, shattering into pieces. The noise echoed through the hallway, sharp and jarring. The woman stood frozen, her face turning pale with panic as she stared at the broken pieces of china. She knew that such a mistake would not go unnoticed. The royal staff could be harsh when it came to mistakes, and she feared the worst. She dropped to her knees, trying to gather the broken pieces, but her hands shook too much. She didn't know what to do. She had failed, and she knew the consequences would be severe. As she knelt there, tears threatening to fall, she heard footsteps approaching. She braced herself for the reprimand she was sure was coming. But to her surprise, it wasn't a harsh voice that spoke. It was a calm, steady voice, one of the royal guards. The guard who had helped the elderly man weeks ago was walking toward her, his steps firm and purposeful. He knelt beside her without a second thought, his movements gentle as he began to help her clean up the mess. "Don't worry," he said softly, his voice reassuring. "It was an accident. It can be fixed." The woman blinked in disbelief. She had never expected a guard to offer such kindness. She had always seen them as stern, unapproachable figures, there to protect, not to comfort. But this guard was different. He wasn't chastising her or scolding her. He was simply helping, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. The guard continued to help her gather the pieces, even though he knew it wasn't his duty. It wasn't what he was trained to do, but it didn't matter. In that moment, he didn't care about duty or rules. He cared about the woman who was clearly distressed, and he wanted to make sure she knew everything would be all right. The woman, still in shock, looked at him, her eyes wide. "But you're a guard. You're supposed to be standing watch, not cleaning up after me." The guard smiled gently, his face softening. "I'm here to protect everyone in this palace, not just from threats. Sometimes that means offering help when it's needed." He helped her to her feet as they finished cleaning the mess. The woman's hands still shook, but she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The kindness of this guard had taken away the sting of her mistake. She realized, for the first time, that the guards weren't just there to protect the royal family. They were there for everyone, no matter their status, no matter their position. As the guard left, returning to his post, the woman stood silently in the hallway, her heart lighter than it had been moments before. She watched him go, realizing that this was a new era in the palace, one where kindness and compassion were becoming just as important as strength and duty. And it was something she would never forget. The shift in the royal guards was no longer just about small moments of kindness. It was becoming a quiet movement, a change in the very fabric of the palace. The guards had begun to understand something important, that their role was more than just standing watch. They were part of a community, a family of sorts, and their presence could make a real difference in the lives of the people they were meant to protect. Their newfound compassion was beginning to spread, slowly but surely, and no one in the palace would ever be the same again. As the weeks continued to pass, the change that had started with just a few royal guards began to spread throughout the entire palace. It was no longer just a quiet shift in behavior. It was becoming a true transformation in the culture of the palace itself. The guards, once known for their rigid discipline and unflinching silence, were now slowly embracing something deeper, something more human. Their acts of kindness, though small and simple, were beginning to have a ripple effect that no one could ignore. One day, during the preparations for a grand banquet, something happened that would solidify the change in the guards. The palace was buzzing with activity as servants rushed around, setting up tables, arranging flowers, and making sure every detail was perfect. It was a chaotic scene, with everyone trying to make the evening a success. In the midst of this, a young woman, one of the palace attendants, tripped and fell as she carried a large vase filled with flowers. The vase shattered on the floor, its delicate pieces scattering everywhere, and the woman sat frozen, horrified by her mistake. She quickly tried to pick up the broken pieces, but the task was overwhelming. She felt the weight of the mistake pressing down on her, knowing that the royal family would not tolerate such accidents. As she knelt there, tears welling up in her eyes, she heard footsteps approaching. She braced herself for the harsh words she was sure were coming. But instead of a stern reprimand, a voice, gentle and reassuring, spoke to her. "Are you all right?" the voice asked. The young woman looked up in surprise to see a royal guard standing beside her, one of the men who had begun showing acts of kindness over the past weeks. She blinked, unsure if she was imagining things. Guards didn't speak to palace staff like this, especially not when they were in the middle of their duties. But this guard wasn't like the others. The guard crouched down beside her and gently helped her gather the broken pieces of the vase. "It's all right," he said softly, his voice calm. "These things happen." The woman stared at him, her heart racing. She couldn't believe what was happening. A royal guard, someone who had always seemed so distant and unapproachable, was showing her kindness, offering help without hesitation. It wasn't just the help itself that left her speechless. It was the way he made her feel. He made her feel as though her mistake didn't define her, that it was simply a part of life. Something to learn from, not something to be punished for. The guard smiled as he finished helping her clean up. "You're not alone in this," he said, his words carrying an unexpected weight. "We all make mistakes. What matters is how we move forward." As the guard stood up and returned to his post, the young woman remained where she was for a moment, processing what had just happened. She had never expected to be treated with such kindness, especially not from someone who had always seemed so distant, so focused on his duty. The kindness of the guard made her feel like more than just a servant. It made her feel like she mattered. Word of this encounter spread quickly throughout the palace. The other palace staff, who had long been used to the stern presence of the guards, began to notice the change as well. They saw the guards not just as protectors, but as people who could understand, who could offer compassion in moments of need. Slowly, the atmosphere in the palace began to shift. The cold, impersonal walls of the palace that had once seemed so unwelcoming were now becoming a place where kindness and connection could thrive. The royal family, too, took notice of the change in their guards. They had always admired the strength and discipline of the palace guards, but now they saw something new. They saw that the guards had begun to embody more than just authority. They had begun to show a quiet strength in their compassion, and that, the royal family realized, was a strength in itself. The transformation in the royal guards was no longer just a series of small gestures. It was becoming a lasting change, one that was reshaping the very culture of the palace. The guards had learned something important, that their duty wasn't just about standing still or protecting the royal family. It was about protecting everyone in the palace, creating a place where people could feel safe, valued, and cared for. And as the days went on, that truth became more and more clear to everyone around them. The transformation of the royal guards had not gone unnoticed. What had started as small, quiet acts of kindness had grown into something far more profound, touching the lives of everyone within the palace. The change was so evident that even the royal family, who had once viewed their guards as nothing more than stoic protectors, began to see them in a new light. They were not just figures of authority anymore. They were human, capable of empathy, care, and understanding. One evening, the royal family decided to hold a public ceremony in honor of the palace guards. It wasn't an event they had planned, nor was it something that had ever been done before. But the Queen, moved by the guards' newfound kindness, felt it was important to acknowledge the change they had brought to the palace. The ceremony would be a celebration of the guards' loyalty and the warmth they had begun to share with everyone around them. The palace courtyard, usually filled with the sound of footsteps and quiet murmurs, now buzzed with excitement. Servants, guests, and the royal family gathered under the stars, waiting for the event to begin. At the center of the courtyard stood the royal guards, lined up as they always were, their uniforms shining under the evening light. But this time, they weren't standing in silence. They were smiling, their faces softening as they looked out over the crowd. The warmth that had been growing inside them was now visible to everyone. As the Queen stepped forward, the crowd fell silent. She looked out over the gathering, her gaze sweeping over the guards who had stood by her side for so many years. But today, they were different. Today, they weren't just the guardians of the palace. They were the heart of it. The Queen's voice rang clear as she began to speak. Tonight, we gather not only to honor our protectors, but to recognize something deeper. Our royal guards have long been symbols of strength and duty, standing unyielding in the face of any challenge. But in recent days, they have shown us something more, something that goes beyond their duty to protect. They have shown us compassion, understanding, and kindness. And for that, we are forever grateful. The Queen paused, her eyes meeting those of the guards standing before her. It is not just the duty of a guard to protect those they are sworn to protect. It is also their duty to lead with heart, to show care and support to those they are sworn to guard. And in doing so, they have brought a new warmth to this palace, a warmth that will last for generations. The crowd erupted in applause, and the guards stood tall, their expressions full of pride, but also humility. The praise they had received was more than they had ever expected, but it was not why they had acted the way they did. They hadn't changed for recognition. They had changed because they had seen the value in kindness, in making those around them feel valued and cared for. As the applause continued, the Queen turned to one of the guards who had helped so many in the past weeks. She called him forward, a smile gracing her face as she handed him a small medal, a token of gratitude. It wasn't just for his service as a guard. It was for his role in bringing change to the palace, for showing that even in the most disciplined of professions, there was room for humanity. The guard accepted the medal, his heart full. It wasn't the recognition that mattered to him. It was the journey he had taken, the way he had discovered a deeper connection with the people he had sworn to protect. And as he stood before the Queen, he realized that he wasn't just standing for the royal family or the palace. He was standing for everyone, everyone who had ever needed a hand, a kind word, or a moment of understanding. As the evening came to a close, the guards returned to their posts, their hearts a little lighter than before. The palace, once a place of rigid formality and discipline, had become a place where kindness and respect were woven into the very walls, and the guards, who had once stood as statues, had now become living symbols of what it meant to protect with heart and strength. The royal family, the staff, and the guests would never forget this moment, for it was a moment that changed the palace forever. The royal guards had not only stood their watch, they had opened their hearts, showing the world that even the most disciplined among us can be capable of the greatest kindness. And that was a legacy that would live on, not just in the palace, but in the hearts of all who witnessed it.